What's going on? I'm KMBest. My current rank at the time of recording this in Marvel Snap is 191. I have finished above rank 200 every single season of this game, and I have played tons of decks in that time. Hopefully what I'm going to do with this video is talk to you about the best decks I've played this season, the decks I recommend, and organized a little bit by tiers. Hopefully that is a helpful sort of breakpoint for you. And we're just going to talk about the best decks in Marvel Snap, the ones I think you should be playing, the ones I have been playing. But I do want to say, before any of this starts, these are the decks I have played. There are certainly decks I haven't played, and there's certainly possible that I am wrong about them. One big omission from this list that you'll notice that I can say right up front is Bast Mr. Negative. It's just a deck I do not have enough experience with. I think it is likely to be quite strong, and we'll cover several of those decks in the honorable mentions section, just decks that I think are likely strong, but I don't have enough of a read on to put them in a tier confidently. So the way the tiers work in this video is that the thing that determines a deck from being tier 1 versus tier 0 or tier 2 is that if I were to choose between the two decks, I would be able to do so fairly easily. That's pretty much it, right? So, like, the difference between a tier 1 deck and a tier 2 deck is that if I had the option of playing a tier 1 deck or a tier 2 deck, I would take the tier 1 deck 95% of the time. With, like, a 95%, like, the vast majority of the time, given the option between 1 and 2, if I wanted to rank up, I'd be playing something in tier 1. Similarly, given the option between something in tier 2 and tier 3, most of the time, I would be choosing to play something in tier 2. It gets a little fuzzier the further we get down. It really does. Like, I do feel confident that I like playing Galactus more than I like playing Electro Ramp, but how much of that is just, I like it? Hard to know. So, what this is basically me saying, like, look, you know this is just my opinion, right? That's really what we're getting at here. This is just my opinion. Granted, I'm a high-ranked player. I have the highest MMR in the beta. I'm still pretty damn good at this game. So my opinion might be worth something to you. But it is just my opinion, so please keep that in mind. With that said, what we're going to do is we're going to go through each deck. We're going to talk about why it's powerful. We're going to talk about what it does to the other decks in the metagame. And then we're going to sort of go on from there. So let's get started with the first tier 1 deck. By the way, they are not ordered within tiers. There's no, like, this is the first tier 1 deck, so it's better than the other tier 1 decks. There's no order within the tiers. If they're in the same tier, I can't really distinguish between them. Or I have a hard time saying with confidence that there is a gap between them, okay? So let's start with this one. This is your baseline Sera Surfer deck. Now, something I really want to get across here, because I know a lot of people, when they see this list, will be like, why aren't you running card? Why are you running card? This is a shape, right? And what I mean by that is, feel free to play with this shell and take cards out and put cards in and try it out for yourself and do what you can. And we'll see what happens from there. We'll see what happens from there. Now, generally, I think when I talk about the shape of Sera Surfer, the things that I would not mess around with right now are you don't play this deck if you don't have Brood. You don't play this deck if you don't have Sera. You don't play this deck if you don't have Silver Surfer, right? And the other things I would not mess around with are, I like the conception of having a 1-drop and 2 2-drops. One of the ways this deck can lose games, even if you draw those cards, is if you end up sitting on just a handful of 3-drops until turn 3. That's always a tough spot to be in. So I try to avoid that. If you have 3 cards that you're happy playing before turn 3, I think that's about the break point. 4 would bring you to almost never missing it. But it does come at the cost of an extra slot, which in this case, I believe in this deck is being used on Rogue, who is a very valuable card right now in the face of Zabu, Darkhawk, things of that nature. So let's move on to, speaking of Zabu, Darkhawk, things of that nature. Before we move on to that, though, I wanted to cover what this deck effectively does for people who aren't aware. Basically, what this deck does is leverage the power of Sera Surfer, which gives your other with an on-reveal effect that gives your other 3-cost cards plus 3 power, and Sera to play a bunch of power on the last turn of the game. One of the best ways to do this is with Brood, which makes multiple 3-cost cards, intensifying the effect of Sera Surfer's buff. But I think the real strength of this deck is that it gets to play powerful, reactive cards as part of a proactive game plan. You get to play Cosmo, which is an unbelievably powerful tech card against many strategies, such as the ones that are reliant on Wong or even Arnim Zola. You get to play Killmonger, which is powerful against decks that run Sunspot or Zoo decks. You get to play these cards and interact with your opponent's game plan while still advancing towards your Sera Surfer endgame. And these are the power. This is where the power of the deck lies. It is safe and reliable, and you can customize it to whatever you need it to be. And you can do, like, if you want to beat something with Sera Surfer, you can do it. And so you just have to have a good read on what you're going to run into. It is a safe choice. It is a good choice, and I do recommend it. Let's go on to the other deck that I have in Tier 1, which is this build of Zabu Darkhawk. But I want to be clear, there are several intriguing builds of Zabu Darkhawk. For example, the Ghost Rider, Lady Sif, Infinite, Giganto, Dracula package is very powerful in this shell. This is the build that I have the most experience with. It is my favorite build of the deck because I tend to build for low downside scenarios, and this deck is always playing a game of Marvel Snap, and then sometimes it just wins for free when you draw Zabu on turn 3. Now, I assume most people are familiar with the Season Pass card Zabu. What it does is it makes your 4-cost cards cost 2 less, and you leverage this power by playing extremely powerful cards like Darkhawk, which gets +2 power for each card in your opponent's deck. You play Rock Slide to put more cards in your opponent's deck. You play Korg to put more cards in your opponent's deck. And what I've done with this one is I've merged it with a Devil Dinosaur theme so I can get that overlap on Mystique, which can copy either Darkhawk or Devil Dinosaur, and Agent Coulson, which can give us a 4-cost card to get discounted with Zabu. There's also some more overlap with Quinjet and Moon Girl. These are cards that fit both of the strategies, right? So this is, I think, if you made me pick one of the Tier 1 decks, I would pick this one. I think it is wildly powerful, and I think it's so strong that I have a budget version of this with no Darkhawk as another deck on this tier list. That's how powerful this deck is. Like, that is an important note. Like, this thing is so strong that even the budget decks are going to be maybe the best thing you can do for a while. And that's like that is entirely down to this card. It is an unbelievable card. When you play it on turn 3, it is the best possible thing you can be doing in the game. We are playing America Chavez in this deck purely to draw it more. That's it. She is not getting played a ton, but sometimes you run out of cards and she is. But it's just to draw Zabu more. He's that powerful. You should be aware of it. You should be afraid of it. And it's gonna be a tough thing to deal with if you are not in possession of Zabu and you run into him. He is a very powerful card. Let's move on to the last deck in Tier 1. And this one, I think I would be able to confidently say I'd rather play the other 2 decks over this, but I do think it's close enough that they remain in the same tier. This is a Shuri Red Skull deck. There are other builds of it that I think are pretty powerful as well, but the fundamental thing you're leveraging here is Shuri, who doubles power, into Red Skull, who has 15 power, and then suddenly you're looking at a 30 power unit that you copy with a Taskmaster. That is the sort of baseline thing that is happening here. It's very powerful. It's what you want to be doing a lot of the time. And it's one of those things where it's like, you think, oh, there's no way this wins the game. But it turns out, yeah, no, 30 power wins a lot of games. 30 power wins a lot of games. But what I like about this build of the deck is you also have an ability to play a small ball game. When you don't draw Shuri, you can just play a solid 0 game plan where you put points on the board. One a little bit off meta thing that's going on here is Dr. Octopus, who is absolutely unbelievable into Silver Surfer decks, and even better when you Shuri him. Because, like, if you Shuri a Dr. Octopus into a Silver Surfer deck, they're almost never actually getting 20 points out of that lane unless they're very lucky or do not have Silver Surfer in hand. And that is a and do not have Silver Surfer in hand and then draw him. And that is a really, really powerful thing to be doing. It does leverage Titania here in order to have a just powerful 1-cost card, because you notice a lot of these cards cost 5. You're often going to be playing a 5-cost card into another 5-cost card. You want something strong to go with it, right? Now, there are other builds of this, builds that leverage Arnim Zola, builds that leverage Sauron and Ebony Maw. This is the one I prefer the most, but I can't say for sure if any of them are better or worse. Just generally, this archetype is a powerful one that I think is a little bit underrated. Now, let's move on to Tier 2. Now, remember, the difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 is that I would confidently play any deck in Tier 1 over the decks in Tier 2. That's it, right? And remember, again, these are not exact lists. A lot of them are just stuff I was trying. Feel free to take things in and out. Feel free to move them around. There are certain specific card choices that I am not positive on. If you have a better idea, normally I will call them out during this, but I do want to highlight that right now. So this is especially obvious with our first one, Shuri Leader. Frankly, I think my editor might have to cut this out, but I think Maximus is actually really poor right now. I am not a fan of Maximus. I would much rather play a Polaris. And the reason Maximus is so poor for me, such a tough card for me to use, is because I am in high elo with a very high collection level. And what that means is the decks I run into the most are Silver Surfer and Zabu. And Maximus drawing those decks cards is so bad. It is so bad. There used to not be a ton of punish for playing a Maximus on turn 3 before those decks were everywhere, but now there is so much punish for this. Now, this deck here is built a little bit differently from a normal Shuri Leader in that it leverages Okoye to get just a little bit of extra points so you can edge out the mirror match. And you have a Taskmaster in there. Again, that's a little bit for the mirror match, where Taskmaster is very good into opposing leaders. So unless the card they played was bigger than the card you played, Taskmaster is usually going to be smaller for them than it is for you. It's a nice way to break leader symmetry in spots where you are unable to do so. So I think this is a valid and viable way of teching this deck against the mirror match. The one thing that you will run into, though, is once you start running into people who play Zabu on turn 3 and play Darkhawk to back it up, this deck falls off. There's not really another way to say it. Like, there's a reason it's in Tier 2, and it's because it has a very poor matchup into a deck doing something as unfair as Zabu Darkhawk, right? So let's move on to Galactus over here, which was the hardest one to rank, because I want to put this deck in Tier 1, but I find it hard to believe that it actually is Tier 1 in the sense that I really enjoy playing this deck. It's a very fun deck to play, but it is very telegraphed. Your opponent kind of always knows what you're doing. They're kind of always clear on it. Now, there's like some things you can get around that with, but like if you play Wave into Galactus into Doc Ock, like they know they're supposed to leave. You're kind of farming 2 cubes a lot. And I should also shout out, in the context of farming 2 cubes, there are a lot of Zabu Shuri decks that have Spider-Man and Absorbing Man and are similarly regarded as 2-cube farmers, but there is a little bit of a wrinkle there where in the Zabu mirror, people tend to snap when they play Zabu. And if you're playing a card that can punish them for that, like Spider-Man and Absorbing Man, you can end up with some more cube equity. And that also works for Galactus, right? If someone plays Zabu into you, and they snap, and you can do the Galactus thing to them, you just do it, right? Like, you are just totally fine to snap back and make that a 4-cuber. So Galactus benefits from that as well as the Spider-Man Absorbing Man decks. Now, Galactus benefits from this sort of cube, the confidence that Zabu brings in terms of cube equity. Normally, people are not super confident snapping early. Zabu has made these people so much more confident, which means Galactus can now get 4 cube wins instead of 2 cube wins. Now, that said, it still does suffer from being a telegraphed deck, which is why it is in tier 2 instead. This is just budget Zabu. This is what I was talking about when I talk about how strong Zabu is. We're just playing a budget Zabu. There's like one pool 3 card in here with Zabu, right? That's it. It's tough. Like, it's actually just, it's so tough because, like, people often come to me and ask me what they should play with their collection. And so many of the times, the answer is just, you should play a budget Zabu deck. Now, I will say, I'm not sure this is the best budget Zabu deck. There are plenty of options. For example, the Ghost Rider Dracula builds are solid pool 3 Zabu decks. I think they're pretty good. You can definitely play those. There are a ton of things you can do with this shell because Zabu is so powerful. And it speaks to the power of the card that I have it in tier 2. This is a budget deck, and it's just as good as some of these other decks. It is just as good. It is a powerful, powerful, powerful thing to be doing. Let's move on to tier 3. The first deck, the 2 decks I have in tier 3, I actually created this tier for these decks because I think they are better than the decks I have in tier 4, but I think that I would rather be playing any of the decks in tier 2 over them, which forced me to create this tier. The first one is Electro Ramp, and I will also say, I think these 2 decks are the best pool 3 only decks in the game right now. Now, there will be some changes when those cards downrank. Shuri, Bast go to pool 4, She-Hulk goes to pool 3, Titania goes to pool 3. This matters. But right now, I think these 2 decks, not necessarily these builds, but these archetypes. Remember, the builds are an example. These are a shape that you can sort of color in, you know? You can, if you wanna take out a card and put another card, feel free, as long as you don't get ridiculous with it, right? Don't take Electro out of Electro Ramp, you know what I mean? So, this is a deck that gains a little bit of equity from people thinking you might be Galactus. I know I have lost to this deck because I have thought it was Galactus and then, you know, like played an Arrow after they waved or whatever, and they just like played a leader. I just looked like an idiot, right? Now, so there might be some different things happening depending on where you are on the collection track, what your rank is, or your MMR, I should say, because rank, as far as we know, does not actually impact matchmaking. Only your hidden MMR does. Matchmaking ranking, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know what that is. This deck basically just wants to play Electro on 3. It runs America Chavez in order to facilitate that. And then after you play Electro on 3, you play a big dumb 5-drop, you play a big dumb 6-drop, and then you play a big dumb 6-drop again. That's pretty much what it is. It's a solid, functional deck, and I think it's not a coincidence that it and the other deck it shares its tier with leverage the power of 6-cost cards and just sort of try to cheat them out. A lot of the best pool 3 only decks, that's kind of the strongest. They need to increase the variance in the game in order to compete with the not the Lockjaw decks, the Darkhawk decks, the Zabu decks. So increasing the variance, like, you need to give yourself a chance to high roll because they're probably playing a better deck than you if you're running it as Zabu Darkhawk. And that's why I like these decks right now. Now, here's the other deck in tier 3, similar construction. We use Lockjaw to cheat cards out and then go to town. It's almost exactly the same thing. We are just trying to not pay retail price for these cards. Now, the one reason that I think this deck is a little bit worse than it would be otherwise for me is that it struggles very hard with cards that put rocks in your deck. Korg, Rock Slide. And those cards are played a lot. Those cards are played a lot in order to buff Darkhawk. Even the Black Widow, which gives you a card in your hand that normally would be good for a Lockjaw deck, because you run Jane Foster, you can just draw them again. There are, like, you just have a kind of a poor matchup into what I consider the sort of meta tyrant, as it were. And that's not really a good place to be. That said, it still belongs in tier 3. So let's move on to tier 4. This is, I think, a very strong contender for being the best budget deck in the game. You need Zero and Dracula as far as pool 3 cards go, and Red Skull. And that's a pretty small amount of cards to need. The one issue, the major issue that I have with it, is there are Zabu decks that leverage Dracula to do stronger things than this deck. And so when I look at a deck like a Zabu Dracula deck that has fully leveraged the power of Dracula to do strong things consistently for cheap, and you're out here playing this and you're playing Squirrel Girl and Iceman, it's tough. It's tough for me to recommend this. It's still very solid, but if you're running into things like Zabu, they're just doing stronger things than you most of the time, and you are at the mercy of whether or not they pull it off. It's a strong, solid, reasonable play. It's good into leader because of Dracula, but it's not perfect. And it's sort of been almost co-opted. There's another deck that does what it does better, and that's a tough thing to be. Last deck is... This is a sad moment for me, because this, I think, is the deck that people most associate with me. Like, people call this deck Bayro because of me, for whatever godforsaken reason. And I am always sad to run into this situation like this. It is so sad that this deck is no longer functional to the level that it used to be. I even have an America Chavez in here instead of a leader, just so I can draw the wave a little bit more. We get like wave into either She-Hulk or Death, but people are just doing so much stronger stuff here. People are doing so many things that are just so much stronger than this. And a lot of your wins with this deck will come from like sneaking ahead and then like wave into Arrow plus Death. And that's good when you can do it, but you kind of need all of those cards to pull it off. And yeah, it's tough. It's a deck. You can play it. But the fact that Zabu discounts works on their cards even after wave, it's bad. it's a bad spot to be in. And even like, you're like, okay, this is very good against the Sera Surfer deck. And it's like, kind of, but a lot of the time they play Sera, you play Wave, they still get to play 2 cards. Maybe it's good a lot of the time, maybe it's not. And it's just a rough spot. There are definitely cards you can switch in and out of this list. This is just the one that I played. I can't say for sure if it's, salvageable per se, but I can say there are other decks that I would probably rather play over it. And now I want to cover a couple decks that I don't have built as honorable mentions. These are decks that I don't have enough experience with, or can't confidently say where they fall, or think have potential, but maybe it needs to be explored a little bit. So this is like, if you're looking for some inspiration, this is the part of the video you want to watch. I think the first of those lists is Bast Mr. Negative. It tends to be a frustrating play experience for me, which may lead to me discounting it earlier than it should be. I think, based on what other people talk to me about it, I think the deck is a little bit worse than the traditional Silver Surfer deck, but that would still solidly put it in tier 2, right? The thing that Bast Mr. Negative does is it trades your ability to play these proactive, or interactive, I should say, maybe they're reactive, cards like Cosmo and Killmonger. It trades that for additional high roll power in the form of Mr. Negative, Iron Man, and Mystique, right? And that's powerful. It's a powerful thing to do. It just generally is not my style. I think there was a while where the deck actually was quite powerful, but as the Zabu decks have refined themselves, it becomes harder and harder to out-point slam them reliably. And so that would be why I would say probably not going to want to play a Bast Mr. Negative deck for me anytime soon. I think its ceiling would be somewhere in the second tier. I would almost certainly rather play all the decks in the first tier over it, but it's still a very powerful deck. Another deck I would like to highlight is, and I don't even know if this is a deck I would like to highlight so much as a card I would like to highlight. I think Thanos is a very underrated card right now. I suspect that there are a lot of good, solid Thanos decks out there, but the major advantage that a Thanos deck has right now is it is very hard to play around the cards that may or may not be in a Thanos deck. It's just hard to do. It's so difficult. I've had Dr. Octopus come out of a Thanos deck. I've had Leech come out of a Thanos deck. I've had Giganto and Dracula come out of a Thanos deck. There's so many things that can be in here that it is very difficult to ever really know what you're playing against. It's hard. And, you know, that's an advantage. That's a big advantage. I've played on stream a deck that played Thanos and Galactus. That's like, no one's supposed to know what's going on there. It's very, very ridiculous. Zabu Dracula, I would say, is just sort of an alt Darkhawk version of the tier 1 Zabu. But I guess I can mention it as an honorable mention as well. It's either in tier 1 or tier 2, the Zabu Dracula deck, which would be just, it relies on America Chavez, Ghost Rider, Dracula, Zabu, Giganto, and the Infinite tends to be the package that you put in there. I think it's more of a package that you put into the deck. I have also, there should be a shout out here, I've also seen people playing the most ridiculous card in Marvel Snap, the Helicarrier. As you can tell, I'm not one of those people, but it looks like an absolute blast. There are so many different things that you can do in this game. I listed 10 decks, and I think you can reasonably like move packages in and out of each of them. Like, for example, there is someone who's playing Surfer, but with the movement early game instead. That's totally fine. You take your time, experiment with it. But what I hope you get out of this video is the sort of general shapes of how these archetypes look. You know, you can look at a move Surfer deck, and you can look at this deck and be like, oh, I get it. They're using the move early game, and that means you can play, you know, Doctor Strange and Vulture because they cost 3. Like, you should be able to sort of see how these changes cascade in the shape, right? So hopefully that was helpful to y'all. Hopefully you enjoyed this rundown. I will have deck codes for all these decks down in the description. Please feel free to like and subscribe. Thanks.